I'd like to begin with an advertising poster for the 1953 movie Roman Holiday. To be as handsome as Gregory Peck. To have Audrey Hepburn's arms around your chest. To be zipping about the eternal city on a Vespa with its most recognizable landmark, the Colosseum, only one of the splendors to greet you on your way. Forget what Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics. This is the good life. If any of the young men present chose the University of Dallas because of the Rome program, because you had dreams of la dolce vita, the sweet life, of romance on cobblestone alleyways with a terracotta backdrop, unfortunately, I must inform you that the director of the Rome program has forbidden students from renting Vespas, that during your Rome semester, it is highly unlikely that the world's most beautiful woman will cling tightly to your torso, and that you will never have as testosterone sculpted a chin as had Gregory Peck. But you can take from the movie an image of the American in Rome. Here, the American is top dog of the New World Order, emerging from the catastrophes of 2 world wars victorious, prosperous and powerful, confident and respected. Here is the American so assured of his place in the world that he can make the eternal city his playground. Here is another image of the American abroad. Chevy Chase as Chicago tourist Clark Griswold in National Lampoon's European Vacation. You hope that you'll be another Gregory Peck, but you have a sneaking fear that you'll be more like Clark Griswold, aiming his camera thoughtlessly at hundreds of objects he can't even identify, shortchanged by waiters and cashiers at every turn, confused by strange tongues and obscure customs, hopelessly searching "Let's go Europe" every 3 minutes for some explanation, dismayed that not a single restaurant provides ketchup packets. We've all heard the stereotype of the ugly American. Bermuda-shorted, red-kneed, loud-voiced, despondent and testy when taken out of a climate-controlled environment. Could that be me? In fact, that stereotype is unfair, as Americans generally are more polite tourists than others are, and so don't be self-conscious. I should warn you about one thing, however, that we do stand out awkwardly sometimes because Americans speak at a higher volume than do most Europeans. So on the subway and museums, keep your voice down. And prepare to be embarrassed. On the 10-day break, you may see some Clark Griswolds on the streets of Paris. And you will see some Clark Griswolds on the streets of Rome. But let me suggest a third image of the American in Rome. The son or the daughter reclaiming his or her patrimony. Be you of Polish ancestry or Mexican or Irish or Vietnamese, whether you do or do not have a drop of Italian blood, I suggest that you regard yourself as coming upon your inheritance. Rome is your birthright. It is not your birthright because you're a citizen of the military-industrial superpower. And of course, on one level, Rome does not belong to you at all. You are not a citizen of Italy. You don't yet know the terrain. You don't speak the language. You will be a foreigner, like a guest in someone's home. And so you should have a guest's virtues before his host, polite, respectful, and grateful. But on another level, Rome is your birthright, because you are a child of the West. The United States, like all the nations of Western Europe and the Americas, derives its laws and to a great degree its ideals and its culture from Rome. Roman Catholics, of course, have a special fealty to and inheritance from Rome. They worship God through the Roman rite and have as their shepherd the Bishop of Rome. maybe University of Dallas undergraduates, as students of the civilization of the West, are more justified than others in understanding themselves as sons and daughters of Rome. Rome is not just for Romans anymore, and it never has been. Last year, in a speech to the Bundestag, the parliament in his native Germany, Pope Benedict said that Europe, and I think he means more generally the civilization of the West, arises from, quote, the encounter between Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, from the encounter between Israel's monotheism, the philosophical reason of the Greeks, and Roman law. This three-way encounter, Pope Benedict said, has shaped the inner identity of Europe. So, Rome, according to the Pope, is one of the three capital cities of the West. But no disrespect to Socrates or King David, maybe Rome remains the imperial city for us provincials. The French philosopher Rémi Brague argues that the West is Roman beyond the presence of obvious Roman cultural influences such as law and architecture. Brague finds that it is characteristic of Rome to see itself as secondary, as dependent on some culture outside of it. That is, Rome gets its intellectual life from Greece. Rome ultimately gets its religion from the Hebrews. Rome is second to Athens. Rome is second to Jerusalem. But then Rome passes on these riches to other nations. The Romans built roads all over their empire, roads that brought philosophy from Athens and the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome, and then from Rome to Spain, France, Britain, etc. Rémi Brague identifies the aqueduct as another great symbol of Rome, passing the water from one place to another place. Think, too, of that deeply suggestive story you know from Litrad 1, from the Aeneid. The hero Aeneas carries his old father Anchises and the household gods to a new place in order to pass on an inheritance to his young son Ascanius. Rome is the eternal city because it preserves the past to share with the future. Rome is the city that receives and transmits. It is like a mother that has received an inheritance from her parents, Jerusalem and Athens, which it has then passed on to her children, the nations of the West. These nations are now grown up and on their own, but a mother should always welcome back her children. Mama Roma has been serving home-cooked meals to her English-speaking children for 1,400 years. As Anglophones, English speakers, you have a particular heritage which grants you a potential identity in Rome that is far nobler than that of man-of-the-world Gregory Peck or befuddled tourist Clark Griswold. For over a millennium, Rome has been for Anglophones, English speakers, a place of pilgrimage and of education. The Angles and Saxons who conquered Britain after the collapse of the Roman Empire received the Christian faith directly from Rome. In the year 597, Pope Gregory the Great saw some blonde-haired pagan boys for sale in one of the slave markets of Rome. He asked who they were and was told that they were Angles from Britain. Truly, said Pope Gregory the Great, they seem like angels, not angles. The pun works in Latin as well as English. And so he sent a band of missionaries to evangelize the Angles and the Saxons. Not long after, St. Augustine headed north, not the St. Augustine of Hippo whom you study, the other St. Augustine. St. Augustine, the missionary, headed north to Canterbury to spread the faith. And soon after that, the newly Christianized Angles and Saxons were headed south to pray at the churches of Rome, to visit the shrines of the tomb of Peter and the shrines of the martyrs. In fact, there were so many Anglo-Saxon pilgrims in Rome that the neighborhood near the Vatican where they stayed is named after them, Borgo Sasia, Saxon town. Just as modern cities may have a Little Italy or a Chinatown, Rome in the Middle Ages had a Saxon town. There were so many Anglo-Saxons who went to Rome. The church you see in this slide, Santo Spirito in Sasia, from the 12th century, is built on the site where in the 8th century an English king, Ina, built a hospice for English pilgrims. That's a little more than 100 years after the first missionaries left Rome for England. Already the English were coming back to Rome. King Ina and his queen Ethelberga themselves went to Rome as pilgrims, as had his father, and as did a number of other early English kings, including the greatest of them, Alfred, who did so twice. A few centuries later, there was even an English pope, Nicholas Breakspere, who took the name Adrian IV. Englishmen and Englishwomen continued to make the pilgrimage throughout the Middle Ages. But with the Renaissance, there was a new kind of English visitor, not necessarily religious, but rather concerned with completing his education and becoming sophisticated and cultured. The idea was that those who were preparing themselves for adult life through the study of the liberal arts, through the study of great Roman authors such as Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, needed to cap off this education by seeing Rome and its monuments, and seeing as well Florence and Venice, then Europe's most dynamic and influential cities. Sound familiar to you? Okay. This trip to Italy for aristocratic and educated young Englishmen became known as the Grand Tour. And indeed, it's the ancestor of the University of Dallas's more democratic and middle-class Rome program. Almost 400 years ago, for example, John Milton was among the young men who made the tour. But not all the Englishmen who went south used their time to better their minds. By the 1560s, Queen Elizabeth's tutor, Roger Ascham, was complaining about the character of his countrymen who returned from Italy. And we'll return you to Litrad I, to Circe, the enchantress, the witch that you know from the Odyssey. He uses the metaphor of possession by Circe to describe these Englishmen who've gone to Italy. But I am afraid that over many of our travelers into Italy do not eschew the way to Circe's court. Yea, I could point out some with my finger that never had gone out of England, but only to serve Circe in Italy. Vanity and vice and any license to ill living in England was counted stale and rude unto them. And so, being mules and horses before they went, returned very swine and asses home again. Yet everywhere very foxes with subtle and busy heads, and where they may, very wolves with cruel, malicious hearts. A marvelous monster, which for filthiness of living, for dullness to learning, for wiliness in dealing with others, for malice and hurting without cause, should carry at once in one body the belly of a swine, the head of an ass, the brain of a fox, the womb of a wolf. If you think we judge amiss and write too sore against you, hear what the Italian saith of the Englishman. Inglese Italianato e un Diavolo Incarnato. That is to say, you remain men in shape, but devils in life and condition. This is not the opinion of one for some private spite, but the judgment of all in a common proverb. And now choose you, you Italian Englishmen, whether you will be angry with us for calling you monsters, or with the Italians for calling you devils, or else with your own selves that take so much pains and go so far to make yourselves both. If some do not yet well understand what is an Englishman Italianated, I will plainly tell him, he that by living and traveling in Italy bringeth home into England out of Italy the religion, the learning, the policy, the experience, the manners of Italy. That is to say, for religion, papistry or worse. For learning, less commonly than they carried out with them. For policy, a factious heart, a discoursing head, a mind to meddle in all men's matters. For experience, plenty of new mischiefs never known in England before. For manners, variety of villainies and change of filthy living. These be the enchantments of Circes, brought out of Italy to mar men's manners in England. Okay. That phrase that Ascham quotes, un Inglese Italianato e un Diavolo Incarnato, an Italianized Englishman is a devil incarnate, was indeed an old Italian proverb. Apparently, there were quite a few sketchy Englishmen who, in their enthusiasm for Italian culture, went native in the worst way. And so I warn you, English speakers headed to Italy, maintain Anglo-American virtues. Show up for class and meetings on time. Throw your trash in garbage bags, not on the streets. On subways, keep your hands to yourself, even when there are attractive women nearby, a problem sometimes in Italy. Then again, Ascham is a Puritan and a priss. You should take back with you some of the habits and manners of Italy. The attention paid to eating well, pleasure in hospitality, and interest in style. La bella figura, the beautiful figure. And this is an Italian ideal, to present a beautiful form to the world. In fact, if you develop an especially sophisticated sense of style while over in Italy, and start wearing salmon pants, maybe a pair you bought at the Moss store in Piazza Vittorio Emanuele for €5, a bargain at twice the price, wear them proudly. And if any Philistines back in Irving laugh at you, and if any Cretans spread false rumors that you've been seen on campus wearing pink pants because they can't even tell the difference, know that you are better than these people. And that your salmon pants bespeak good breeding and a rich interior life. But it wasn't just the desire for education and hip fashion that brought Englishmen to Italy in the 16th century. A new group of religious travelers were arriving in Rome. Just as English Protestants had fled to Protestant Geneva to flee persecution during the reign of Catholic Queen Mary, English Catholics, after her Protestant sister Elizabeth took the throne, now fled to Rome. For recusants, that is, English Catholics who recused themselves from attending Protestant services, refused to attend them, Rome was a city of refuge. Because Gregory the Great had been the Pope who had said the Angles were really angels and sent missionaries to them, the English Catholics frequently congregated at the church named after him, San Gregorio Magno. In one corner of the atrium of this church, which overlooks the Circus Maximus, and which recently was Mother Teresa's headquarters in Rome, are two funeral monuments to Englishmen who died in Rome. Here's a picture of Edward Karns' monument, with a relief of the Virgin and Child at the top, and at the bottom of a pelican plucking its breast, a traditional symbol of Christ, as pelicans were thought to give their blood to their children, as Christ gave his to humanity. Zooming in on the inscription, we learn that Karn was a knight who served as an ambassador in Rome, and who, after the death of the Catholic Queen Mary, because of England's break with the papacy, willingly stayed in Rome because of his Catholic faith. Queen Elizabeth ordered him to return to England, but the Pope found him a position so that the Catholic Englishman could remain in Rome and practice his faith. The monument put up by his fellow Catholic exiles Thomas Freeman and Galfred Vaughan after Karns' death in 1561 doesn't mention that Karn had first gone to Rome in Henry VIII's service, asking that the Pope annul Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, ultimately the source of the break with the papacy. Nor does it mention that the Catholic Karn was still such a good Englishman, still such an English patriot, that from Rome he wrote letters to Queen Elizabeth warning her about Catholic conspiracies against her life. The next monument at San Gregorio Magno especially well demonstrates how English Catholics were torn between their faith and their patriotism. In 1564, Robert Peckham had been given permission by the English government to leave the country, quote, for his farther increase of knowledge and the remedy of certain diseases. That is, he told them he wanted to travel for reasons of study and health. In fact, he wanted to practice his faith without fear of imprisonment and confiscation of his property. He went to Rome, where he died in 1569. His monument reads in translation, "Here lies Robert Peckham, Englishman and Catholic, who, after England's break with the Church, left England because he could not live in his country without the faith, and having come to Rome, died there because he could not live apart from his country." In fact, Peckham's heart was removed from his body and sent back to England for burial. Catholic Englishmen who wanted to study for the priesthood went to the Venerable English College in Rome. It's in the very heart of Rome, just behind the Campo dei Fiori. The English community in Rome had first bought this property in 1362, and it was turned into a seminary after the Reformation. It is known as the Venerable English College because between 1581 and 1679, less than a century, 44 of the young men who studied here to become priests were martyred when they returned to England. Another 130 on returning to England were imprisoned or were exiled. A painting in the chapel prepared the young men for their return to England. The crucified Christ is being held up by God the Father, with the Holy Spirit, the dove, between them, and Christ's blood drips onto a map of England on the bottom. On either side are two English saints, Thomas à Becket and King Edmund, and below and in the background is there the Flaminian Gate, which is the gate into Rome that traditionally people coming from the north, such as Englishmen, would take to come into Rome or take to leave Rome. An angel holds a motto. See the cherub, the angel there holding a motto, which reads in translation, "I've come to bring fire to the earth." Whenever news arrived that a former member of the college had been martyred, the students would gather around the picture and sing Te Deum. To you, Lord, goes the glory. A dangerous life awaited them back in England, but in Rome too there were perils. Some of their fellow seminarians were in fact spies sent by Queen Elizabeth to keep her government to keep tabs on them. One spy, Anthony Mundy, who later betrayed the Jesuit Saint Edmund Campion and ultimately became a playwright, wrote a book about his time there, The English Roman Life. Because of their heroism, the seminarians were honored by many Romans, including Saint Philip Neri. A little digression here, but I hope that during your time in Rome, you get to learn about this most playful saint, who has been called the Roman Socrates because he would spend so much time striking up conversations on street corners. The Italians call him Il Santo Amabile, the friendly saint. And Pope John Paul II dubbed him the Apostle of Joy. I'd like the church to recognize him as the patron saint of hanging out. Right? People spend a lot of time hanging out, right? Shouldn't you say a prayer before you hang out and goof off? Right? To say it to St. Philip. St. Philip's Church was right across the alleyway from the English College. Before going back to England, the newly ordained priests would ask him for his blessing, and he would greet them, Salvate flores martyrum, hail flowers of the martyrs. I've often wondered whether St. Philip might have met a young Englishman who may have stayed at the English College in Rome, not as a seminarian, but in the guest house. In the visitor's book during the 1580s, there are entries for Gulielmus, William, Gulielmus Stratfordus. This is the period that Shakespeare scholars know as the lost years, when we have no records as to where he was. Could Gulielmus Stratfordus be that William of Stratford? Rome continued to be a refuge for English Catholics. In fact, an English Catholic king was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in 1766, more than 1,000 years after his predecessor, King Enna, died and was buried in Rome. You'll see the grave of James III in the crypt of St. Peter's, near where some of the recent popes have been buried. But my guess is probably none of you have ever heard of King James III. And if you pick up a history book, you'll find no such person as James III. His father, James II, was the last of the Stuart kings. He'd converted to Catholicism, but then been kicked off the throne, in part because of his Catholicism, and forced into exile. His son, in quotation marks, James III, was commonly known as the Old Pretender, as he never actually ruled as King of England. He was 6 months old when the family fled England. But the papacy regarded him as the true king of England, Ireland, and Scotland. And so he gets this big monument in St. Peter's. The papacy would continue to support the Catholic Stuart family's claim to the British throne throughout the 18th century. And on the ground floor of St. Peter's Basilica, right by where you exit the church, you'll see a monument to the Stuart family. Ladies, if you are hoping that there may be some handsome descendant of the Stuarts still living in Rome, whom you could marry and then be able to claim that you are the true Queen of England and not that usurper Elizabeth II, sorry, the last of the Stuarts was a priest who died 200 years ago. But before we leave the Stuarts, I want to tell you about that priest's mother. Her monument faces the Stuart monument at St. Peter's. So as you exit the church, on your left will be the monument to the family. On your right will be this monument. Someday, I'm going to write a screenplay about Maria Sobieska Stuart. And this screenplay is going to make me a rich man. Because the movie made from it is going to be the greatest chick flick ever made. It has an Irish hero, Colonel Charles Wogan from the Wogans of County Kildare. Colin Farrell would be the bigger box office draw, but I think Daniel Day-Lewis, even though he's getting a little old, would bring more dignity to the role, so I'm going to go with Daniel Day-Lewis. I'm going to cast him. In Rome, he serves King James III, in quotation mark. That is the old pretender. Not yet too old, 30 years old. So King James III, 30 years old, living in Rome, and he needs to father Stuart babies, right? The line needs to continue. He needs a wife. The pretender sends the dashing Irishman to find him a bride. And so Colonel Wogan, Daniel Day-Lewis, visits various royal families around Europe to write scouting reports on their daughters. He checks out the Sobieska daughters, whose grandfather Jan Sobieski was the heroic Polish king who saved Christian Europe from the Turks at the Battle of Vienna. There were 3 daughters. The oldest, Colonel Wogan found dour. The middle one is a little too carefree, but the youngest one is just right. 16-year-old Maria. Is Emma Watson ready to be a romantic lead? Or should maybe a Keira Knightley might be the safer choice for Maria Sobieska Stuart? By the way, this story of the youngest one being just right sounds like a combination of Cinderella and Goldilocks. Okay? But Colonel Wogan said, yes, this is the bride for my king. Wogan makes the arrangements and returns to Italy to tell his king the happy news. And so now they await for the beautiful Polish princess and her retinue to arrive in Rome for the wedding. That party, however, has to travel through the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe, including what's modern-day Austria. The Holy Roman Emperor, at this point, is allied to Great Britain. And the British king, the actual one, okay, the guy in London, not Rome, is not happy to hear that his rival is marrying into a powerful family and becoming allied to the then powerful Kingdom of Poland. He tells the Holy Roman Emperor not to let her get through to Italy. And so, Princess Maria is apprehended and imprisoned in a castle. A princess imprisoned in a castle. Okay? Does it get any better than this? Word gets back to the old pretender in Rome, so he tells Colonel Wogan, find her. The Irishman leaves in November 1718, disguised as a French merchant. And learning that the princess is in a castle in Innsbruck, Austria, seeks out her father's assistance. But while Maria Sobieska's grandfather was the hero of the Battle of Vienna, her father did not possess the same spirit. On New Year's Day, he tells Wogan that he wants no part of this quixotic adventure, and instead offers one of his other daughters as a substitute for Maria. Thanks, but no thanks, says Colonel Wogan, who then heads to the castle, aware, according to a contemporary account written by a friend, quote, that if he failed, he could look for nothing but to perish on an Austrian scaffold. Happily, he discovers that a regiment of Irish soldiers who had gone to fight for France because of the English conquest of Ireland are stationed not too far away. There he finds his uncle. I'm thinking Liam Neeson for the older Irishman, right? Liam Neeson. And two childhood friends who agree to join him on his chivalric quest. Right? By the way, it's no longer just a chick flick. Now it's a buddy movie too, right? A nice wide audience here. One of the Irish soldiers is accompanied by his wife, who brings along her French maid, Jeanette. Jeanette is in love with one of the other Irish soldiers, Captain O'Toole. Okay, I think this is the Colin Farrell part. Okay, Colin Farrell is Captain O'Toole, with whom Jeanette is in love. And out of devotion to Captain O'Toole, Jeanette agrees to be part of the plan. The soldiers and the women pretend to be a party of French aristocrats traveling through Austria. They arrive in Innsbruck in April 1719, take rooms at an inn, the Black Eagle, and wait while Wogan and Jeanette go to the castle, she pretending to be the lord of the castle's mistress. It's near midnight, and while Colonel Wogan hides outside in the rain, the French maid, pretending to be the mistress, gets into the castle, finds the princess, and exchanges clothes with her. The beautiful princess, Maria Sobieska, escapes from the castle. And only 2 days later will it be discovered that the girl in her room is someone else. Wogan and Maria rush to the inn, meet the others, and leave. But wait, a complication. Maria had forgotten her jewels at the inn, which if discovered will give away the whole intrigue. Captain O'Toole, Colin Farrell, turns his horse and gallops back. The landlady had locked the inn and gone to bed, but O'Toole sneaks into the Black Eagle, gropes around in the dark, and finds the jewels. Soon they're off again, with O'Toole trailing behind to fight off any pursuers, and providing some comic relief when he tricks an Austrian official carrying an arrest warrant into getting drunk and steals his papers. Wogan and Maria make it to Italy, but according to some accounts, along the way, the princess starts to have feelings for her gallant rescuer. The man who had first recognized her beauty, but he is a faithful knight and brings her to his king. There's an epilogue to this story. Okay? It's actually quite sad. This, by the way, this is a true story. Captain O'Toole, Colin Farrell, soon after dies fighting in battle for France. Colonel Wogan, Daniel Day-Lewis, for his gallantry is honored by the Pope and named a senator of Rome. He eventually goes into the service of the King of Spain, and in old age, the knight whose quixotic adventures Maria's father wanted no part of is appointed governor of La Mancha, Don Quixote's home. Remarkable coincidence. The old pretender and Maria have 2 children. The young pretender, those of you who are of Scottish ancestry, you should know about Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his younger brother, Henry, the one who becomes a priest. But the marriage is a deeply unhappy one. The old pretender, James III, was aloof and neglectful. Maria high-strung, and eventually the Queen of England, who never sees England, runs away to live in the convent of St. Cecilia in the Roman neighborhood of Trastevere. After 2 years of pleading, she returns, but she has adopted a life of severe religious discipline, fasting and praying on her knees much of the day, giving away her wealth to the poor, and she wears herself out, dying at the age of 33, but then honored for her piety by Pope Benedict XIV with this monument. Maria Sobieska Stuart is not the only beautiful foreigner to die young in Rome. In Litrad 2, you studied some of the poems of John Keats, Ode on a Grecian Urn and Bright Star. and he is buried at the Protestant cemetery in Rome. His tombstone reads, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." At the age of 25, dying of tuberculosis, Keats left England for Italy, hoping that the warmer weather would help. It didn't. And he spent what he called his posthumous existence, his last 3 months, tended by his friend Joseph Severn, so ill that he never left his apartment next to the Spanish Steps to see the sights of Rome. Severn, after marriage and a career as a painter, would return to Rome as a diplomat decades later, where he died nearly 60 years after his friend Keats, and he's now buried next to Keats. Many Englishmen and other non-Catholics are buried at the Protestant cemetery, such as another Romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, whose heart is here. In recent years, UD students have taken on the service project of tending the graves, a new tradition that is worth continuing, that I encourage you to do. I hope I'm not being too morbid with all these pictures of tombstones and monuments, but in Rome, one is constantly reminded of the dead. Last year at the great Jesuit church, the Jesu, I was surprised to look down and see that I was standing on the stone for a woman from New York who had died in Rome in the 1840s. In that 19th century, a new group of English speakers becomes prominent in Rome, the Americans. They are so numerous and so prosperous that in the 1870s, Protestant Americans living in Rome have built a splendid Episcopalian church, St. Paul inside the walls, not too far from the train station. A University of Dallas professor, Dr. Davies of the English and Classics departments, served as a vestryman for the church while and after he taught on the Rome campus. Not only do we have an American church here in Rome, we have American saints, or at least Americans looking like saints. In the apse of the church, St. Ambrose has the face of J.P. Morgan, the American financier. And here, the members of the church militant include Ulysses Grant and, in the green tunic in the middle, Abraham Lincoln. Speaking of saints, the first one born and raised a Catholic in the United States is St. Katherine Drexel. She was born in Philadelphia to one of America's wealthiest families, but it was in Rome that her path to sanctity became clear. Coming from such wealth, she was able to support missions to Native Americans and African Americans. And when visiting Rome in 1887 to secure a meeting with Pope Leo XIII, she was able to secure a meeting with the Pope and asked him to support the work by sending missionaries. But at their meeting, the Pope turned to her and said, "Why don't you become a missionary?" She was shocked. But after prayer and discussion with her spiritual director, she took religious vows and used her inheritance to start a new order, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, to serve the missions. The Americans have kept coming to Rome as pilgrims, as students, and yes, as tourists. In the 20th century, they also came as soldiers. A little south of Rome, in Anzio, you will find an American military cemetery with almost 8,000 headstones for American soldiers who died fighting Nazi Germany, died in Italy. It is a moving cemetery to visit, and it's not too far from campus. Most of the young men buried there were around your age. And the people of Anzio have shown their gratitude and honored the dead by maintaining the grounds beautifully. I hope that these images and stories have revealed that there is no reason, even when you get lost and are befuddled and confused by the language, to feel like Clark Griswold. And again, you don't have the chin to feel like Gregory Peck. Remember that the history of English-speaking visitors in Rome is a noble one, something unfortunately easy to forget when you see the drunken idiocy of American and British students in Campo dei Fiori on a Saturday night. You can draw from that noble past to discover your own purpose in Rome. In fact, the legacy of religious and educational endeavor continues. Our final picture is of a University of Dallas alumnus, Father Joseph Van House, here serving Mass with Pope Benedict. He joined the Cistercians after he went to Rome, graduated, joined the Cistercians, and then went back to Rome for his theological studies. He's since returned to the Cistercian Abbey across the street and is now teaching understanding the Bible. This picture is not meant as a recruiting tool for the Cistercians, but as a reminder that one's purpose in Rome should be noble, and be it through pursuing one's faith, growing in one's faith life, through pursuing education, be it in the church, be it in the world, Rome may launch one on to great things. Thank you. Okay, I can take questions if anybody has some. Yes?
Okay, I had a question. The girl in the story that stayed behind and switched clothes with her, whatever happened?
They let her go. Yeah, so it all worked out fine. I don't think she got to marry Captain O'Toole, unfortunately. But, well, that would have left her a widow if she'd married Captain O'Toole, right? Maybe she married some guy who lived a nice long life and provided well for her. But they let her out of the castle. So, any other questions? It really is remarkable. I mean, everybody goes to Rome as a pilgrim, right? If Christians from all over the world go to Rome as a pilgrim, and when you go to Rome, that's one of the things that's just striking, that everyone is there. But among the Northern Europeans, the English did have just the strongest tradition of going to Rome. It was just part of their culture very early on, to the point, as I mentioned, that they even had their own neighborhood in Rome. Very good. Enjoy yourselves next semester.